good afternoon or good morning. I am having a discussion with Matau, who wrote an exceptional piece of work around a decolonial exploration of indigenous knowledge systems. This forms part of our Social Justice Week, of our annual Social Justice Week. So our theme for this specific discussion falls under Indigenous knowledge, social justice, and transformation. I will allow you, Amatao, to introduce yourself. Who are you?
Good morning. My name is Matau Interview. I am currently a researcher with the Unit for Social Justice and Institutional Change. I have worked, my interest has always been in knowledge management, research, and so forth, particularly indigenous knowledge.
Indigenous
Right.
knowledge.
So I just recently completed my Master of Theology in Religious Studies, specifically focusing on indigenous knowledges.
Oh, okay. Now, this is very interesting because, the issue of decolonization, indigenous knowledge, have been a topical issue in higher education for quite some time now. I think it also forms part of the debate around how do we see ourselves in these institutions of higher learning education, and also on issues around what are universities for. Are universities for the knowledge of self, where we come and learn about ourselves and our societies? So there's been a number of discussion around this issue. So I just want, for the benefit of our audience, just, give us an understanding around decolonization, And when you talk about this indigenous system, what are we talking about? So that whoever is listening is not understanding these concepts,
Right.
So just to begin our discussion.
Right. In my study, in my research, when I was speaking of indigenous knowledge systems, I used the ordinary understandings. Like indigenous knowledge systems are native tools, methods of knowing, ways of knowing, of interacting with the world around you for the purposes of survival, and it's transferred from one generation to another, usually orally, and is often practiced by native people native to a particular territory or who claim a particular ancestral connection to a specific land. So that's the standard understanding of what indigenous knowledge is. Where I came in, I was in our case in South Africa, I was particularly interested in how there's a discussion, of course, about how indigenous knowledges have been lost, how much of it has to be preserved, and so forth, but not so much articulation of how it was lost, or not so much an articulation of events that led to it being lost. Because as we understand it now in the literature, indigenous knowledge is context-based.
Yes.
It's used in a particular locality. That's what led me to decolonization. Because in decolonial studies, the prevailing theory of knowledge is that all knowledge is local. Right? What we're being taught in our classrooms, many may argue, it's colonial knowledge. It's knowledge local to specific worlds. We cannot claim universality. Some things are applicable, some things transcend that, some things don't. Some disciplines transcend. I think the hard sciences, the natural sciences do their best to transcend locality, but our humanities have done great efforts to think about knowledge in a local space. So decoloniality for me meant investigating the locality of indigenous knowledge, and in its space, what that localness did, what kind of richness that localness imbued into indigenous knowledge or took away. I think that's, and I use a particular thinker's work. I was looking at Walter Minolo's work. I picked two concepts. The idea in decoloniality, there's the idea of a colonial matrix of power. One, there's an idea that coloniality is not a singular or multiple singular events. It's literally linked to the bigger project of modernity. So that's where I was going, and I kind of used that in my analysis, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
But that is quite interesting because one would want to know how we should view indigenous knowledge systems in a modern society. I think you also speak about that. Would you also want to comment on that?
Yeah. Okay. So if you're going to do a decolonial study and a decolonial exploration of indigenous knowledge systems, it means you must reckon with the kind of unsaid word, unspoken, invisible word in decoloniality, which is coloniality. So in my study, what I did was I looked at specific events, acts of parliament at the time, legislative methods that kind of had an impact on indigeneity, indigenous peoples, and so forth. So we cannot not reckon with coloniality. So I'm looking at indigenous knowledge from the 1913 Land Act, and also I think in our context now we're just going to talk about those two. There are others that I look at, but relevant to our discussion now is the 1913 Land Act. It was preceded earlier by the Glenn Gray Act, but I didn't look at that. My focus was on the Land Act, 1913. This was passed shortly after the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. And then you have the 1927 Native Administration Act. Now, these two acts are colonial acts, right? But what they do is show us multiple things. The first one is natives are taken from where they were residing, alongside other white farmers, non-native farmers, and so forth, where they're growing their agriculture, where there's their cows, they're herding, they're living their lives. Suddenly there's this act that's kind of passed hastily through government, right? And after it's passed, literally the following day, life changes for the native people. There's scheduled areas. They have to move to certain specific areas where they're only allowed there. If they stay on the farms, they become servants. Now they're servants to their neighbors and so forth. They're servants to other people. They have to sell their sheep. They have to give up their land and so forth. And I think I spent a lot of time kind of doing kind of a reading from Saul Plaatje's Native Life in South Africa. He recounts the aftermath of the act being passed. So he travels around the country interviewing people about the impact this act has had on them, right? One of the most startling stories is of he encounters a family on the road. They're on their way to a scheduled area, but they don't know where the area is. And their child is sickly, and the child passes away. The trouble they were having is they do not have land. So where are they going to bury the child? Must they bury the child right there on the road? What of their rituals? What of their customs around? So multiple things are lost in that relocation. If indigenous knowledge is context-based, a knowledge that is about navigating the space around you, about living in a particular space, place, and time, now the indigenous knowledge is shifting,
Mm.
or it's breaking.
Yes.
It's a rupture of some sort, because now you can no longer practice husbandry as you knew it. You can no longer practice your customs as you knew them. Space has also been condensed.
Mm.
Whereas we used to have sprawling space where you had your animals, your farming, all of your day-to-day life activities. Now you're in a condensed space stacked on top of other people, and now your practices, your knowledges, or what you thought you knew about the world has changed. So that act for me signified a rupture, and it showed, it kind of brought forward one of the key components of indigenous knowledge. When people define it, they talk about displaced natives, indigenous people, people without land. So that's one of the big formations, discursive kind of discourses that underpin our indigenous knowledge as we know it. So I just went about showing how that act impacted and showed the discourses underneath. Yeah. And then the following act, what it does is it builds on the previous one. The breadth and scope of the 1927 Act is amazing. It's huge. It's about administration of who can marry who can marry when, who can rule what tribe, what kind of life a native must lead, who can be a commissioner, who can sort of lead people, who can practice what. Indigenous knowledge is recognized as witchcraft, which is specifically now banned. Whether from even if you use word of mouth to kind of share the knowledge, it's now something that has been legalized. It's something that it's now a crime. It's something that has been used to kind of, to criminalize knowledge. So I hadn't said that specifically in my research, but I think that's what happened. Day-to-day life was so tightly managed, so controlled, right? With no space for this knowledge, yeah.
But this is quite an interesting topic. What triggered you to want to write about this aspect? I know right now the issue of the land questions are topical issues, but what triggered you to say them? I need to explore, this topic.
Yeah. Okay, there's two situations. One was that I've always been interested in theories of knowledge. And if you follow that route, take it to its logical consequence, I could not but help what is my own knowledge. So what counts as African knowledge, or what theories do we as South Africans or as native people have about knowledge? So that's what led me to indigenous knowledges. And the second one was a more personal one. Because I'm a traditional healer, some of my practices, there are spaces that we need. We need land, we need water to be able to practice, right? But access to these things is so heavily bureaucratized, and some of the adjoining lands to rivers belong to certain people. So I began to ask, if land is such a potential issue, if I have to practice the knowledge that has been handed down in my house where I was trained, I then have to go ask for permission from someone else to cross their land and so forth. So that is also a prohibitor. It's kind of like a resisting mechanism, or a lingering effect of colonialism, and even a kind of visible modern effect of neo-colonialism. Yeah.
So would you say that is what sparked your interest in having a deeper, thorough understanding of indigenous knowledge systems?
I think I'd read a lot of indigenous knowledges from scholars across the world, and what seemed articulated there for me were there were understandings of various nations. If you take in Canada, which is an occupied indigenous native land, so there you have various tribes, but what I see there is people have concepts. They've articulated, they've bothered to articulate their indigenous understandings. There isn't a singular indigenous knowledge. That's why I always emphasize indigenous knowledges. So they emphasize the idea of grounded normativities, which is knowledge that is coming from the ground, from here. They emphasize the idea of resurgence, rebirth, and so forth, interconnectedness. We have done the same, but I think what I wanted to do was just for our knowledge, for our indigenous knowledge, to go deeper underneath for us in our context and say, this particular moment is the surface where you see indigenous knowledge as we know it emerging as a knowledge of displaced people, for instance. And I wanted to say, at this moment, because there's 3 periods I'm looking at. I'm looking at from 1913 to during the Union of South Africa, during apartheid, and during right now, post-apartheid South Africa.
Yeah.
So traveling like that, I wanted to see what it looked like, indigenous knowledge, and what underpinned, what affected it. And then during apartheid, what happened to it? It had to go, obviously, it had to go underground. And right now, what is happening with regards to indigenous knowledge? So, and what I looked at policies, acts of government, and so forth. So there's the idea of power, colonial power, neoliberal power, apartheid power, impacting the knowledge that people hold, or the idea of themselves that people hold, native people hold. And I just want to add, the idea of native, who's native and so forth, is heavily contested.
True.
Which is fine, I'm fine with that. But if you look at the 1913 Act or the 1927 one, I'm not sure which one, it's very explicit about who is native. It's non-European, it's African-born, and there was no contestation because it's a law, it's going to be passed. They're very clear, it targets Black people.
True.
So in that context, when we're talking about indigenous knowledge, here is an indigenous person. There isn't a kind of backwards forwards, because a kind of a economic, legal event was taking place which would have ramifications, enriching others and dispossessing others, because the dispossession wasn't just of indigenous knowledge, it was of land. So it was economic, it was legal, it was humanistic, it occurred on so many levels.
And it actually defined, I mean, if you look at the 1913 Act, it defined who is native.
Yes.
The 1927 Act defined who is native.
Yes.
So we know who was dispossessed, we know whose land was dispossessed.
Precisely.
Now, which brings me to my next question. I mean, what features a lot is can I just open quotation, the land question? I mean, that comes out a lot on your study. It features out a lot. I just want you to, just take me through your analysis, because I mean, it is true, it is factual that we are still a country battling with the legacies of apartheid, with the legacies of colonialism. That is why perhaps Parliament is struggling to deal with the land question. So it does feature prominently, just, your analysis.
Phew. I mean, we've been talking about land from the get-go. So in terms of indigenous knowledges, what is in our context, because it's so contested, there's difficulty in who exactly is indigenous where, right? But as you say, the acts clearly state who is indigenous and who is to be possessed, who is to be sent from this place to that place. So if the places where people were uprooted from were places for farming, for agriculture, for living, now suddenly they are condensed in an arid space with no new, with the old ways having, now they have to let go of the old ways. The old ways was, it could have been subsistence, being able to farm for themselves, being able to live comfortably off the land. But now the land question brought about economic, what do we call, servitude. So there's now the land question. In my study, it touches on capitalism. So now here we are, capitalism has had an effect on people. People suddenly have to go work elsewhere for someone else as servants. They cannot practice what they know. So bringing forth what the land question does is it takes the invisible in the colonial matrix of power, which is institutions of management and control that the colonial administration had, that were used to enact the acts and used to implement the acts and kind of keep the world they had built or created together, right? So that colonial matrix of power is kind of brought visible. So you cannot talk about indigenous knowledges without talking about the land. So when you talk about the land, you kind of expose that, okay, so this is a displaced knowledge, it's a fragile knowledge, it's a knowledge that was subject to early capitalism. It's a knowledge that had to be rendered hidden, because in as much as the colonial administrations had their own colonial matrices of power that kind of enacted their two policies that I just mentioned, we had schools for traditional healers, right? Like we have now. What happens in these schools is the preservation of knowledge, the transference of knowledge, the generation of knowledge, right? So in as much as it shows that the knowledge was hidden, it shows also that there were actual, what do we call them, entities of knowledge that indigenous people had. It also brings forth the lie. It exposes, it betrays the colonial administration's lie that native people need to be controlled and managed. If they needed, and they're not advanced, they're not sophisticated, they're subhuman and they're primitives. The act, by sheer scope, shows you that the colonial administration knew exactly who they were dealing with. You're not allowed to carry sticks, you're not allowed to have this thing, you're not allowed to have this thing in your house, women should do this culture, this tribe, the king can only be this person who is recognized by the native commissioner, and so forth and so forth. So they knew that they're dealing with complex structures already. So it betrays the idea of indigenous knowledge or indigenous peoples as primitive, as other. They already know. So it tells you then perhaps other interests were at play. So it exposes the advent of capitalism, because the land didn't just go to the farmers, it also went to the miners, right? The mining companies, sorry. Now people had to go. Now there's a labor force for those mines. I have to give up my beads or whatever. I have to give up my farm or whatever, and now I must go dig the earth, which I think it would probably, for somebody who had practiced indigenous knowledge then, it would have been something sacrilegious, to go dig the earth, because you're disturbing the ancestors. So there's a lot happening with those two acts, especially the idea of land, right? So ruptures, there's just the land act is just ripples across the nation. So this is a knowledge that is dynamic. It has to survive. So if it could survive the displacement from one locale, and when you hear it's prospering, green, fertile ground, that's where the knowledge was. The people are displaced to infertile, arid, condensed spaces, and the knowledge survives still to be with us today. You're talking about something dynamic. In as much as it's fragile and it's under constant threat, and the people who hold it are passing, you're talking about something that can move. Can move for the purposes of surviving, of whatever the native needs it to be.
I just want to come, like, in terms of, do you think it is then possible to reconcile the indigenous knowledge system with some of these Western theories, or our approach is shunning these Western theories in a modern context?
Look, in what I did was, in my study, I looked at various models of knowledge and how indigenous knowledges come to play. But I'll tell you that there was a question raised recently which leads me to believe something else. Now, I looked at the archaeology of knowledge, I looked at ecology of knowledges, I looked at the philosophy of science, and how I looked at specifically the different kinds of disciplines and knowledge models in higher education, and how they've dealt with indigenous knowledge, how they've integrated indigenous knowledge. What has been done is to include it here and there. But indigenous knowledge is not an asterisk or an end, just like decolonization. It's not something you do just to add to your curriculum. Once you include indigenous knowledge to Western knowledge, to what is seen as Western knowledge, what happens usually is there's a critique. It criticizes what you've been teaching for the past, let's say it's a semester, and indigenous knowledge comes out at the 5th month. What you've been teaching for the past 3 months now has to be questioned. Because if you center the perspectives of these people, of the indigenous, history looks mightily different from the way it's being passed down, from the way it's being taught. Now you're talking about people surviving, you're talking about people losing, you're talking about lives being lost, you're talking about what we would call a kind of a philosophy of death. Right? You're no longer talking about dates, so and so arrived and this happened. You're talking about spiritual kind of reckoning. So I said 2 things, right? It's, you don't just include it in your curriculum. It's something that upends a curriculum.
Basically becomes, you mainstream it in your curriculum.
If you mainstream it, your curriculum is going to look different. I want to give you an example. Say you're teaching philosophy, and you've been, because in the philosophy of science, the idea is that science is objective, it's neutral, it's fair, it's observable, it's repeatable, and it's independent, right? When you put in the indigenous perspective, we're saying science is local, sciences are multiple, sciences depend on context. Like if we look at our mpepo, traditionally grown plant that we use to connect with the ancestors, mpepo in KZN is not the same as mpepo in Free State. The texture and the quality is different, right? Because it depends on the environment under which it's grown. So, and then the question becomes, okay, so if you're saying science is objective, is repeatable, what kind of science are you talking about? Whose science are you talking about? Yes, it's observable and repeatable in KZN. You can do it there, I can do it there, but to transport it wholesale and bring it here and try to replicate the same results in a different environment don't give you
the same results. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. So I lost a lot in this. Even my favorite philosophers I had to let go.
Yes.
Charles Taylor, who wrote The Politics of Recognition. So he had talked about the value and the importance of recognizing the other. He also said indigenous knowledge is kind of pointless because we have the guttering gun. So now it's military might, is the status of the empire, the power of the colony that comes into play. So he recognized that power drives who decides what knowledge is. We cannot stand against Western or European might because we can pontificate and say indigenous knowledge is this, but we do not have the guns, we do not have the economic might or whatever. I think that was his point. Yeah. So, but I think to include it in curricula, to include it in the space, it means more than just talking about it. It means more than just talking about decolonization, or it means doing.
Yeah, yes, because I think you bring this interesting dynamic of power, and those that are in power then being a threat to these to indigenous knowledge systems.
Right.
To what extent does your research then connect with social justice and transformation in South Africa?
Well, I mean, that's actually beyond the scope of my research, but now we have to think about what kind of social justice we're talking about. Are we talking about distributive justice? Are we talking about restorative justice? What are we talking about? Because one looks at repairing, right? And one is about equity. So what kind of social justice, what is the current moment in social justice? What are we striving toward? What are the ills or the challenges or the prevalent inequities that we see? So in my context, the inequities that we see is ceaseless poverty, homelessness, people stacked in unsanitary, uninhabitable conditions. For me personally, those are the things I observe around me, and those are the big issues that we can talk about job disparities and the need for parity between white and black, between men and women and so forth. But what we don't touch on is the ugly elephant in the room of land redistribution and what it, if done properly, what it could mean economically. So that's another kind of social justice. Not just including people into the economy for the purposes of the capital, but including people for the purposes of their humanity. They're people. They deserve to live. Their right to live is not contingent on their ability to produce.
Human dignity.
Human dignity. Human dignity, yes. I think your dignity, your right to live shouldn't be, but our right to live right now, being in the late stages of the capitalism, is contingent on whether you can. So South Africa is beautiful, it's huge. We have scaling greenery, we have oceans, we have rivers, we have everything. But somehow the question of poverty, the question of landlessness, of homelessness still persists. So how do we talk about decoloniality? How do we talk about indigenous knowledge in an honest way? Is to look at the invisible conversations within those things. And the invisible conversation there has been the issue of land.
The connection between land and dignity.
And dignity.
Dignity.
And it's funny. One of Sol Blakey one of Sol Msani's contemporaries, JJT Jabavu. He was a missionary student, then became a teacher at one of the missionary schools. He was thoroughly into the missionary education that he had been taught. So his view was, you can't trust the ways of the native. They are a speculative, superstitious kind of lot. So then he says, he thinks disparagingly that the native, when you go to his house, he knows winter is coming. He only has enough resources for this season and the next. He lacks long-term vision. Right? That's what he's saying. But if I counter-read it in my need to understand our indigenous knowledges, it's telling me a different story. We're talking about here in this current era, we talk about global inequity, poverty, we talk about scarce resources, we talk about it's not global warming, what do we call it? Environmental precarity. So there's a lot. But here you're looking at a group of people or a nation of people who use the resources sparingly. It's easy to see it as laziness. How about we see it as the need to be in communion and the need to be in balance with nature? If you pluck out the tree and even take the roots and use everything, then the tree is gone. If you take out just enough for next season, you can still come back and get more. So I think that was my reading for that little bit. I just needed to mention. Yeah.
It's quite interesting in the national project, really to heal the injustices of the past. Because we often have this discussion about the Constitution, for example, being an anticipatory document that we still envision and hope for a South Africa that embraces human dignity, and dignity also connects to some of these issues that you have raised. Community that speaks to equality of all, and really a community where you are free to be. That the whole idea of freedom, and which brings me to my last question. Perhaps before I hear your last remarks, we are in an institution of higher learning. And I really do want to ask, really, what are universities for? Keeping in mind the idea of human dignity, keeping in mind the idea of equality, keeping in mind the idea of freedom in its broader sense.
In its broader sense. That's a very difficult question. So I'm gonna try to answer you from my lens. So knowledge is clearly not unfamiliar to us. If you look at traditional houses of learning where people go to become healers, there's knowledge taking place, right? There's creativity, there's connection with ancestors. And your ancestors are tasked with accelerating your knowledge, helping you know better yourself, your world, and helping you heal. Right? We're in a university space, so we want to accord dignity to everybody. Everybody is human being in a university space. We're learning, we're walking around in a space whose ancestors' knowledge are we transferring, whose ancestors are excluded. So the question of ancestors is not just spiritual, it's also intellectual, right? Because we cannot put on par Shakespeare with Credo, for instance. You would be laughed out of the English department, for instance, if you try to do that. But he's someone's ancestor. Shakespeare is someone else's ancestor. So now we're sharing these particular stories of this particular culture. So our knowledge needs to kind of be multi-plural, not just plural for the sake of plurality, but plural because it is enriching to be able to move in the world and be free in the world, because nothing is alien to you.
True.
Nothing is other to you. So it's even with the buildings, the architecture, right? Our architecture is colonial. What would a indigenous architecture look like? But now you've got to bring the economics into it. The capitalism comes into it, because nobody's going to demolish a building just to set up a traditional healing, which is interesting because what South Korea did after their decolonization, after their independence from Japan in the 60s, I think, or 40s, I'm not sure. But after their independence from Japan, what they did is they set up schools around the country where their indigenous knowledge could be preserved and healed and taught. So that's why in South Korea, medicine is synonymous with traditional medicine. There isn't a strict demarcation that you go to a sangoma when you need this one. The medical aids can afford you to go to this one and this one either, because they invested in entities of knowledge, of transferring, of preserving their indigenous knowledges, right? Have we done that? In as much as our constitution is anticipatory, the values are commendable. Did we, and I think that's what decolonization is, did we think that there was something worth retrieving in our indigenous knowledges? And if we had thought so, did we make any effort to build entities, schools centered around that, or to empower those who already have schools centered around that? Yeah.
This is quite an interesting conversation. I think we could go on and on because what would be your closing remarks?
Phew. I there's a there's a video. There are multiple videos about Africanization. You'll see in one video, this guy is carrying he's in the middle of nowhere. He's carrying his backpack. He's walking somewhere. He looks like you, like an ordinary guy going somewhere, or to university or school, presumably. Then comes these guys chasing him, and he tries to run away. These guys who are chasing him are carrying spears, and they're dressed in their traditional garb. So he's running away from them. It's about I think I'm talking about a 5-minute film. He's trying to run away from them, and eventually they capture him. He was running away scared, right? And when they take him, they're not jostling for him or tying him or whatever. They're lifting him up all together, and they're carrying him to what I presume to be a homestead. And then they kind of hide with him for a little bit, and he comes back out dressed the same way with them. And they're singing with him now, and he's smiling on his face and so forth. So in my closing remark would be, it looks frightening, decolonization. It looks like loss. It looks like something we must run away from. But it's something as Native people, as Indigenous people, as scholars in Indigenous knowledges or in the universities, something that could uplift us. And embracing that makes us richer for it. And may give us back a philosophy of joy, of being, of life, of just replenishment and resurgence and survival and so forth. Yeah.
You got me reflecting on, you know, how it's also very important for us to understand the indigenous knowledge economic systems, to what extent, because now what we knew, what indigenous people knew was taken from them as means of survival. It did not mean that they were not surviving. The question is, how were they surviving? So really, in our next session, I think, but I do hope for us to have a second session, that we really reflect on the economic systems that were lost in the process.
Yes, that would be interesting to do. And I kind of have been looking at the banking systems about who it excludes. And those people who are excluded, where do they go? So I was thinking about the ideas that is Stokfele and so forth, how they replace for the people who cannot be legitimized by banks, and it's still, Stokfele is a communal thing. It still embraces the ideas of togetherness and so forth, even though the interests are steep. But outside of exclusion, the ones who are excluded, who are marginalized, what do they do? And what did they used to do before? But anyway, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. I'm just reminded about this fascinating thing that I picked up in the rural Eastern Cape. Do you know that it's no longer difficult to bury somebody? Like in the past, like the past 10 years or so, it was so difficult. Perhaps a family doesn't have means. So now communities have developed systems of funeral policies. I mean, funeral insurance to ensure that the person is buried. It's a beautiful system.
We also have it here in the Free State.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for
telling me. Thank you.